Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name as always is your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in to today's show, and for this midweek edition of the show, we have a great one ahead, starting off by making some bold predictions for the 2025 NFL season. Never too early to do so. Of course, going to be going over my midweek NBA power rankings as has come tradition around here. We're looking at what's next for one of our CFP teams, perhaps the most shocking one, Arizona State, after an incredible turnaround of a season in their second year under Kenny Dillingham. How do they ensure they can at least make 2025 special yet again? Then I'm going to be ranking all the new head coaching hirings around the NFL thus far. We're still waiting on the Saints job to be filled, but that should take a while considering the nature of the New Orleans Saints. But still, we have 5 new head coaches, and I'm going to be ranking each and every single one of them. And then we conclude by looking a little bit prematurely at a FA Cup matchup in the 4th round between Brighton and Chelsea, two very similar teams with very differing philosophies. But before we get into any of that fun stuff, I do want to remind you, as always, to like, follow, and subscribe to the show if you do feel so inclined and you want to keep up with all the new content that we release around the network and the other shows as well. But if you want to contribute and interact with our shows a little bit more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to get your opinions, feedback, input on air. You can also go to our website, gsmcspodcast.net, to do it as well. Any tips or donations as well, genuinely appreciated by all concerned, but it just makes our shows that much better when you, our friendly audience, are willing to contribute. Without further ado, let's jump right into our first segment of today's show, and it's never too early to talk the 2025 NFL season. We're about a week away from the 24 season concluding, so why not get an early start on looking ahead to 2025, and whether it be new faces and new places, surprising stats that might pop up, shocking MVP runs. It's always fun, to look ahead to the future in the NFL, and 2024 left us a decent blueprint as to how a lot of these bold predictions could come about. But ultimately, without further ado, let's jump right into them. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, any thoughts about these predictions and how they might pan out, feel free to leave them in the comments section below. So, let's just jump right into it, starting off with a very, very wild prediction concerning a free agent QB moving to a new home, potentially not the new home a lot of people might have initially thought. So starting out with Sam Darnold and the weird destination of the Las Vegas Raiders. Yes, I think that Sam Darnold could be in the running to be a Las Vegas Raider, even though it certainly seems as if a Pete Carroll and Russell Wilson reunion is ever more likely. But ultimately, the fact the Raiders are not in a good enough position to potentially trade up to get a QB, I feel like Sam Darnold, if they look towards free agency, is the better option, the younger option over Wilson, and won't necessarily garner much money. I could see him in a similar range as, say, a Daniel Jones, 4 years, $160 million, where if you have to move on from him, you can, and potentially find a young QB in next year's draft where there's going to be a lot more talent. So I feel like Sam Darnold will be the perfect bridge option or even long-term starter for Las Vegas. And I feel like in Pete Carroll's system, he fits perfectly. A lot of the things that Russell Wilson did well when Pete coached him in Seattle, I think that Sam Darnold can do as well, with even better arm talent at this point in his career and a little bit more mobility as well. But ultimately, I feel like the Raiders will lean into the Pete Carroll old school mindset a little bit, trust the run game, and I feel like Sam Darnold can supplement that as well, because he did an excellent job of doing that with Aaron Jones in the backfield, making sure the run game was an integral part of the Vikings' success as well. So I think he would be a perfect fit in Las Vegas, and perfectly fit into what Pete Carroll might envision for the future of this roster. So even though it's looking less and less likely, and potentially Russell Wilson could be going there any day now, Sam Darnold could make sense for Las Vegas for the long run rather than more of a short-term option with Russell Wilson. Then the second bold prediction for this NFL season, and this one is not so far-fetched but still pretty out there in terms of how ludicrous it could be to some. Aaron Rodgers to ultimately retire from the NFL entirely. Obviously, the Jets have a new head coach in Aaron Glenn, who we'll be talking about a little bit later, and he is defensive-minded. So, potentially, the quarterback situation might be somewhere in the back of his mind and not at the forefront, considering the fact that the Jets have a very impressive defense and Aaron Glenn is chomping at the bit to bolster that side of the football. But the quarterback situation for the Jets could become very interesting if this is ultimately the case for Aaron Rodgers. Because Aaron Rodgers is someone who I feel like could buy into Aaron Glenn's philosophy, but might want to go somewhere where he ultimately has a little bit more control of this offense. And this is not an indictment of Aaron Glenn, because as a defensive-minded coach, you feel like coming into a new setting, the defense can be the first thing you can look to improve. But ultimately, Aaron Rodgers is not someone who is looking to lean on the defense for victory. He's looking to be proactive in how he leads an offense. And right now, I'm not necessarily certain, considering the fact that the Jets have a few free agents on that side of the football, in terms of Garrett Wilson, a couple O-linemen, who I feel like might sway Aaron Rodgers to either plying his trade on the free agent market or retiring entirely. So I feel like this one could go either way, but it all depends on how Aaron Glenn proves his vision for Aaron Rodgers. And so that being a factor could see him stay another year with the Jets, see what Aaron Glenn is all about, or could see him move on in terms of, say, a trade or via free agency, or just, like I suggest here, retire entirely. So this one is very much up in the air, but I still think anything is possible on this front for Aaron Rodgers. Speaking of free agent quarterbacks, well, not necessarily complete free agent quarterbacks, but speaking of quarterbacks who could be staying in one destination or leaving, I think that in the case of Justin Fields, it would be right for the Steelers to sign Justin Fields, but potentially draft a QB in, say, the third or fourth round, a guy like, say, a Jackson Dart, a Quinn Ewers, a Dylan Gabriel, or a Will Howard, who they can build up behind Justin Fields, because make no ands, ifs, or buts about it. Justin Fields, yes, was a little bit more unimpressive than Russell Wilson as the starter for Pittsburgh, but he still went 4-2, showed some of his dual threat abilities, and ultimately looked a lot more exciting than he was for Chicago. So I feel like if Pittsburgh sees Russell Wilson leave, they will be fine with re-signing Justin Fields to a short-term contract and potentially hedging their bets on being able to develop a young QB in the draft. They hadn't had success with this in the past. Kenny Pickett as the prime example, but ultimately I feel like the Steelers need to stay young at the position. And Justin Fields is as good an option as any in terms of still being under, say, a rookie contract. I think it expires either this year or next year, though. But ultimately someone who's a safe pair of hands and who, if you do decide to draft another QB, can be seen as a bridge option. And you can cut ties with him at whatever time on the cheap, and it won't necessarily eat into your cap space. So I think that this will be a very astute thing to do if you're the Pittsburgh Steelers. Then let's stick with the QB train here. But speaking about a QB who's definitely not leaving his franchise, not for a long time, but someone who will continuously prove to the point we're talking of him as an MVP candidate come this time next year. How about Jaden Daniels making a bit of an MVP run? This seems like the best prediction that could possibly happen for the 2025 season, because Jaden Daniels proved that he is ready for the NFL stage. He is unswayed by any situation, as we've seen in his deep playoff run this year with Washington. And going into year 2, obviously, a couple teams worry about the sophomore slump. We saw with CJ Stroud. We've seen it now for the past couple of years with a guy like Trevor Lawrence, who has not had stability at the coaching position. But ultimately, the reason why this one does not seem far-fetched, that everyone who has bought into this Washington Commanders team, whether it be the coaching staff, the organization outright, the front office, is not going anywhere. They're truly in this for the long run. And no matter what happens next year with Jayden Daniels in Washington, whether good or bad, they won't care because they're sticking by their man. And I feel like in year 2, Jayden Daniels has even more of an opportunity to shine now that Washington truly believes in him and entrusts him with this role of franchise QB. So I think that year 2 for Jayden Daniels could be even bigger than year 1. And then the final prediction, this one is a little bit bold, but I could potentially see this happening even though it will come between 2 division rivals. Tyreek Hill, that is ever disgruntled Tyreek Hill, could be traded to the New England Patriots. This will be definitely a very interesting proposition if this does occur. But the reason why I don't necessarily think that this is a far-fetched prediction is because New England is still rebuilding. Even if they go out and make this big acquisition of a guy like Tyreek Hill, they still would be in the gutter a little bit. And it would all depend on how they build the draft and how Vrabel positions himself as their head coach with his philosophies. But ultimately, I could see Tyreek Hill being an intriguing option for this New England Patriots receiving core to really diversify it a little bit. It does tend to stagnate a little bit, this New England Patriots receiving core, when you look at the similarities between a lot of these guys, like, say, a Kendrick Bourne, or, say, I'm blanking on the other receiver's name, but very similar in terms of their abilities. Want to get vertical, and that's not a bad thing for a guy like Drake May, who's not afraid to throw the deep ball, but just to diversify this attack a little bit. Why not get 2-1? A savvy route runner, but also a guy who can get behind defenses. So this one could be a long shot, but at the end of the day, I would not be surprised if these two sides ultimately come to an agreement that sees Tyreek head up north. But let me know what you think about these predictions in the comments below. All of them very intriguing in their own right. But after this short break, we head into, as always, as has become tradition, our midweek NBA power rankings. See if they remain similar to last week's or there is change at the top right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our midweek NBA power rankings, as always, we want to remind you yet again that if you wish to contribute and interact to our shows, as well as my own and those around the network, more directly consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube, as well as our website, gsmcspodcast.net. to either leave opinions, feedback, inputs for our show, but as well as tips and donations, though they're genuinely appreciated as well. They just make our show that much better when you, our faithful audience, are contributing to it. But without further ado, let's jump right into our midweek NBA power rankings, see if there is any change to the top, even though the top 5 has been little more than really stagnant at this point. We know who the core 5 teams right now in the NBA are, the teams that should be competing for the Larry O'Brien Trophy come June. But ultimately, we could see a couple moves in the coming weeks as teams in both conferences continuously improve. But for now, I still think it remains chalk at the top. But if you have any feedback, input, any qualms with this list at all, do consider leaving a comment. As always, it is greatly appreciated, and I love hearing your opinions as well. They ultimately inform my own, as well as I don't necessarily watch the NBA as much as I would like to. So if you have any interesting stats or facts to update me on, I will gladly oblige them and talk about them as well. But without further ado, let's jump right into our midweek NBA power rankings, starting off at number 5, potentially one of the hottest teams in the league for who they've beaten, considering the fact that they've beaten the Cleveland Cavaliers twice in the past 2 weeks, and the Boston Celtics, both top Eastern Conference standings teams in terms of where they rank and in terms of form as well. How about them Houston Rockets? And it's not necessarily who they've beaten, why they've beaten them, but how they've beaten them. They are tied with the Phoenix Suns for the most clutch victories in the NBA. In their past 11 games, they won 10 of their past 12 of them. And then, in terms of road performance as well, they won 10 of their last 11 on the road. And I really like how that sounds if I'm a Houston Rockets fan. Not only beating the teams you could likely be competing against come the postseason, and you're going to have to continue beating them because you have 2 games against Memphis and New York in terms of the span of 2 weeks, but ultimately how they're doing it as well with this rotation. And one player I really want to highlight is my potential Rookie of the Year, Amen Thompson. Truly special player. In 3 of their past 6 games has scored 20-plus points, really being one of the most clutch performances evidenced by his game-winning shot against Boston on the road, 1 of their 10 road victories in their past 11. So I do think that this Houston Rockets team is capable of anything. They just have to believe that they can outscore anybody. They truly are one of the best offenses in the entire league. And at this point, they're not necessarily creeping up on anyone anymore. We know that the Houston Rockets, every single game, no matter who they play, will come to battle. And that's a scary proposition for the rest of the Western Conference and the rest of the NBA for that matter, as this Houston Rockets team is built to last. So they sit at number 5 with potential movement in the coming weeks to the top 3, maybe potentially to the top 2 to come potentially for this very talented Houston Rockets team, should they continue as they have been. Then at number 4, a team that, yes, suffered a very tough road setback against the New York Knicks, but had won 6 in a row up to that point. I feel like this Memphis Grizzlies team, though, is very defined in how they want to play. Jaren Jackson is becoming a bit more of a go-to scorer to compensate for Ja Morant in terms of the inside-outside development with them, and they really have been getting a bit stronger in terms of who they can play in the front court, having a rotation of guys who can play multiple positions, whether it be the 4 or the 5, like Edey, like Brandon Clark, like Jay Huff, and really kind of accommodating for the play of Ja Morant as well. Because if Ja Morant continues to be the dynamic player we know him to be, it is paramount that they get production out of their front court, and they've been doing that very well, but it's just going up against these physical teams, right? Going up against teams like the Knicks, going up against teams in their own conference, like the Thunder and the Rockets, who they'll have to play tomorrow night, and who have already beaten them 3 times this season. So it's going to be important for Memphis to continue to develop that front court, to better build around a guy like Ja Morant who can explode at any certain moment. But ultimately, I feel like they're good enough to compete in the Western Conference, but they just need to prove it against the teams that they might be facing come the postseason. So that's where I kind of stand on Memphis. This is a team that can move many different ways. They can move up this list, and they can certainly move off this list. But I just feel like right now, they're a team coming into their own, and that could be an interesting proposition as the season plays out. Then at number 3, a team seemingly in a bit of a quote-unquote crisis mode. As a fan of this team, I'm not necessarily completely panicking, but I am worried at their play. The Boston Celtics. This is an interesting team, right? Because they are so reliant on the three-point shot. They are so reliant on the depth of this team. But ultimately, the record over the past 2 months does not show what this team is capable of. They're only 13-11 since December 7th. So as you can see, they're definitely kind of faltering in key moments throughout the season. And yes, they have a chance to recuperate after the All-Star break, potentially add a couple depth pieces. And we talked about that yesterday. And we'll talk about it continuously next week about how they can add to this team. But ultimately, they have to work with what they got as well. But ultimately, another interesting thing is that they're still in the top 10 in a lot of important statistics. They're still 8th in total offense, 4th in defense, and 3rd in net rating. So they're not playing completely poorly. It's just that I feel like this team isn't necessarily as motivated as you would thought they would be at this juncture in the season. But considering the fact that if you look at all the events of the offseason for this Boston Celtics team, Jason Tatum not necessarily playing as often in the Paris Olympics, this whole debate about whether or not JT and JB will be elite players even with this championship. All this white noise could be disturbing them at the moment, but they're still, at this point in the season, the 2nd seed in the Eastern Conference standings. So, while they could potentially slide out of these rankings if this blip continues, I still think that this is certainly a team capable of kicking it into high gear and getting back into a rhythm. It's just that some of that white noise might be seeping into their minds a little bit at this juncture of the season. They're waiting for the All-Star break to arrive, and then after, we potentially see a newer, improved Celtics for the 2024-25 postseason. Then at number 2, the Cleveland Cavaliers. An interesting story with the Cleveland Cavaliers. To start the season, they needed 20 games to accumulate 3 losses. For the first time this season, they found themselves in a 3-game losing streak last week. They were against very solid teams, mind you, but it was their first 3-game losing streak of the season. That's still a very impressive stat, the fact that the Cleveland Cavaliers have not lost 3 games consecutively all season long until then, and it took them 20 games to find their first 3 losses. But I do feel like in those 3 losses, they still played the Cleveland Cavaliers with just untimely errors or late game rallies that came up short that kept them down. For example, in their game against the Rockets, they had to rally from a 17-point deficit late in the 4th. Against the Embiid-less 76ers, they just couldn't keep up with them, and Ty Jerome's career performance ultimately wasn't enough. And then again, against the Rockets a couple weeks ago, Darius Garland misses a couple clutch free throws with limited time left that would have seen them win that game. So it's not like Cleveland is playing badly. And it's not like, this 3-game losing streak could become a trend for them. And they did pick up a nice win against Detroit last night in kind of a respite game. But ultimately, I feel like this Cleveland Cavaliers team is playing with house money. No one expected them to be the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference standings midway through the season. So ultimately, when we view a 3-game losing streak for the Cleveland Cavaliers now compared to when they were constantly winning, it could be a little worrisome, but not to me, because I still believe in this Cleveland team. They continue to be the best team in the Eastern Conference. But they're not beating out the number 1 seed just yet. The Oklahoma City Thunder. Now, we can talk about the exploits of SGA, leading the league in scoring, and in terms of his defensive prowess being fourth in steals. But I want to talk about how they line up, how they rotate this squad. Isaiah Hartenstein, as you all know, was facing an injury over the past couple of games, a high ankle sprain, came back, had a great performance last night, contributed on both ends of the floor. When Isaiah Hartenstein plays for Oklahoma City, they are 23-2. Combine that with Chet Holmgren, I'm checking the stats here, 4 of their 8 losses have come when both of them miss time. So as you can see, I feel like this team is very, very loaded in the front court. Because even without both of them, 2 guys who can impact games both ways, I feel like this Oklahoma City team does not care. Rather they're 500 without 2 of the better depth, the big men in the league, I feel like that tells you a lot about how this team is performing. Because it's not just SGA. And if it was, then it would be very Denver Nuggets-like. But I do feel like it's very telling that when these 2 big men come together, this OKC team is perhaps the toughest team to beat in the league. And even without them, they could still very well be the toughest team to beat in the league because of that depth. So I just wanted to present to you that interesting stat about OKC and how tough it is to beat them when both of these guys are playing, especially when Hartenstein is available, because he was a very, very important acquisition this offseason for them and really helping them in terms of depth. But let me know what you think about these rankings in the comments below, because coming next, we continue looking at what could be next for certain CFP teams, and this time around we're looking at perhaps the most shocking CFP team this season, the Arizona State Sun Devils, from 0 to hero, picked last in many Big 12 preseason polls. Could they potentially have an even better 2025 after losing one of the best players in their history? We'll be right back after the break to talk about that as well.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. And for our third segment of today's show, we continue with this trend of talking about what could be next for all 12 CFP teams. And for today, we are looking at perhaps the most shocking of them all, the Arizona State Sun Devils. What a story they were the 2024 college football season. Let's talk about them a little bit. They were picked last in many a Big 12 preseason poll, not necessarily seen as some team that could break out at all this season after a 3-9 season in the first year of the Kenny Dillingham era. But in year 2, a complete turnaround led by redshirt freshman Sam Levitt and all-purpose player Cam Skattebo. This team completely turned its identity around and became the Big 12 champion and ultimately took Texas to one of the best games in the CFP era to overtime. And so I feel like a lot of people might be saying, well, after such an incredible season, after such an incredible turnaround, there's likely going to be a little bit of regression from this team. We see it with all, in fact, Big 12 teams that have overachieved in their own right and made the CFP. We saw with TCU most recently in terms of how they declined after their run at the national championship game. But ultimately, the reason why I feel Arizona State could continue with this success in the Big 12 is A, because no one saw them coming this year, and B, they're not necessarily losing too much production. And as a school in the Big 12, who's one of the smaller schools in that conference, they have the advantage of finding these hidden gems and developing them better than any other elite program really can. Because it's what they did with Cam Scadaboo, who is now departing for them. But ultimately, that's what I like about a program like Arizona State. You find the guys in the recruiting trail who you invest in and you build them up. And Kenny Dillingham proved that in spades this year. And I'm not counting him out as being one of the elite coaches in college football for the next 5 to 10 years because of what he did this year and because of what he has and what he's able to do in the coming years ahead. But ultimately, we do have to talk about the elephant in the room and how they replace a guy like Cam Scadaboo in their offense, and also how to ensure that redshirt freshman Sam Leavitt does ultimately continue to improve after an incredible freshman season without elite weapons in Xavier Gilroy and Melquan Stovall at his disposal this year. So it's all about replacement and ultimately retooling for this Arizona State squad, but I believe they're better equipped than anyone to do it. So without further ado, let's talk about what they need to do and what could be next for this program to really skyrocket these next couple of years. So obviously, let's talk about Cam Scadaboo and what you have to replace there. You have to replace the second most scrimmage yards last season behind only Ashton Jeanty with 1,711 yards. You have to replace the 21 touchdowns, and you have to replace one of the best games in college football playoff history where he garnered 450 all-purpose yards in a literal puke and rally game that ultimately took Texas to overtime. And I feel like, it's going to be very hard, but they do have a very deep backfield this year, supplemented by one of the more underrated, in my opinion, transfer portal additions of the offseason. One of the only military service academy transfers of the offseason as well. Kanye Udo of Army, leaving the option offense and going to pastures new, coming to Arizona State. And while I definitely view this as a very funny transfer in terms of moving from a very disciplined school in Army to one of the biggest party schools in the nation, it's still an astute pickup by Arizona State. I feel like, yes, the option offense is going to have to be worked out of him, and he's going to have to coalesce with Sam Leavitt, a dual-threat quarterback in his own right in the backfield, but I really like what Kanye Udo can bring, because he's also, much like Cam Scadaboo, a very physical back who is more so built in running people over than finesse. They have some finesse guys like Raleek Brown in their backfield as well, but I do really like the continuity of bringing someone in like a Kanye Udo to take over. And I feel like, combined with Sam Leavitt, who in his own right can create out of structure, and with his legs, I feel like it's the perfect balance as well. And Kanye Udo's transition from that option offense over Army to this offense at Arizona State will be seamless just because of the fact that it's not like he's not Cam Scadaboo and is someone who can just break off 75-yard runs like an Ashton Jeanty with finesse alone. I feel like he's built in the image of what Arizona State want, and I really like what he brings. He himself ran for over 1,100 yards, even in an offense heavily tailored to Bryson Daly. So I do feel like Kanye Udo could be a very, very smart pickup by the end of 2025 for Arizona State if they play their cards right. But in terms of recruiting, not necessarily too much on that front in terms of big players that can make differences in places where holes need to be filled. But they do add two very intriguing players. They add ESPN 300 QB Cameron Dyer, one of the better dual-threat QBs in this year's class. And I think he's a very interesting option to learn behind Sam Leavitt, as both of them have dual-threat abilities. And it's a ESPN 300 prospect that a school like Arizona State wouldn't even dream of having a couple of years ago. So that's the advantage of making the CFP, saying, hey, we can build on this year together, come join us. And then a 3-star safety who's highly underrated in this year's class, Joseph Smith, and highly underrated in terms of filling the shoes of someone like a Shamari Simmons, who's one of the most elite players in their defense, and who they heavily missed in the CFP. So ultimately, Joseph Smith could be a very interesting addition, but not necessarily too much on the recruiting front. Now let's get into why Arizona State is so special. Because with this season under their belts, they're even bigger players in the transfer portal, where it matters, especially in the Big 12, because the Big 12 is now losing a lot of its luster. It's now perhaps the 4th best conference in the Power 4, but it's still the toughest conference to play in the Power 4 as well. So, because of that, you're going to have to be very proactive in quickly replacing the talent and production that is leaving your team if you're in the Big 12. And that's what really hampered TCU, as they could not replace guys like Duggan, guys like Johnston with transfer portal additions. But because Arizona State proved they can hang with a team like Texas in the CFP, proved that you can go here and succeed, and it's starting to become a little bit more attractive to a lot of these transfer kids. And because they're a party school, I gotta harp on that Kane Udo move as well. But ultimately, one other area of need that I view a little bit more highly on the list than replacing Cam Scadaboo's production is wide receiver. Leavitt had a great year in spite of what he had in his wide receiver core, because outside of Jordan Tyson, who was luckily returning for him, they didn't have much. And much as I liked what Xavier Gilroy and Melquan Stovall could do, they didn't necessarily give you that much production. They only had, 800 and 600 yards respectively. I feel like you want another winner on the perimeter if you're Arizona State. Another guy in the slot who's a little bit more savvy in terms of helping Sam down low to ultimately offset what Jordan Tyson can do. Because I need to see, if I'm Arizona State rather, a little bit more balance out of this wide receiver core. Jordan Tyson can't be the dominant force for another year for Arizona State if they want to get back to the CFP at that point. But I do like the risk they are taking in the transfer portal, because they brought in 3 receivers who I think can really help in different areas. They brought in an unproven guy, a redshirt freshman in Noble Johnson, who didn't play much at Clemson. They brought in the number 2 tight end in the transfer portal in Kamari Anderson out of Kentucky. But the guy who I'm most intrigued by is Jalen Moss out of Fresno State. This is going to be his junior season, but ultimately I really like what he profiles as in this Arizona State offense. He can be kind of the complementary piece to Jordan Tyson here. He had 1,200 receiving yards, over 1,200 receiving yards in his career at Fresno State. Former 3-star prospect. Last year, he kind of saw his numbers drop a little bit. Only 563 yards and 4 touchdowns to account for. But ultimately, I feel like in a world where a team like Arizona State, these are ultimately the guys who we are looking for. These are ultimately the hidden gems who become the Cam Scadaboos of your team. And so that's what I like about knowing what you need to replace, to bolster, and ultimately taking risks, willing to be able to take risks, for that matter, on players like a Jalen Moss or a Noble Johnson. Because while they might seem unproven, that goes to show they're willing to be molded by a team like yourself. Because if I'm looking as a transfer to go to a team, and I'm thinking, well, I want a team with a high profile, but not necessarily a team where, I'll be forced to be the star for most of my career, Arizona State certainly becomes appealing because you get an opportunity in the Big 12 to play in one of the toughest conferences in the country, but you're not going to be too heavily scrutinized, and you have the opportunity to become an underrated superstar, much like Cam Scadaboo was all throughout last year. So if I'm Jalen Moss and Noble Johnson, I'm really excited about this in terms of the trajectory of my career, because it really proves that even though the reputation that Arizona State gets, it's an astute move just because I'm now learning in an offense that can produce guys who go under the radar throughout their career, who become hidden gems for the school, who lead their school ultimately to the CFP like Cam Scadaboo, and most importantly are willing to develop and grow in their own right. So if I'm Arizona State, I should be very happy about what I've been able to do already in the offseason, because it's what you need to do as a school in the Big 12 who has a very challenging path to the CFP. No matter what, outside of the reputation of your conference, you have to play tough physical teams week in, week out. So if I'm Kenny Dillingham, if I'm the Arizona State organization or athletics program, I have to be really, really thrilled for the future. Because even though you lost a lot of production, a lot of talent, you built him up. You built up Cam Scadaboo. And what you can do now is dip into the portal and go again. And I feel like Arizona State has proven that they're willing to do that and follow that model for as long as Kenny Dillingham as their coach and for as long as players are willing to invest in this small school. But let me know what you think about this rebuild in the comments below for Arizona State, because coming up next, we are ranking the NFL head coaching hirings thus far. We're still waiting on the New Orleans Saints job to be filled, but ultimately the 5 head coaches who've been hired are all great in their own right. But let's see how I rank them after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows. Available every...
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of today's show, we are ranking all 5 of the new NFL head coaches on how they were hired, why they were hired, and what they could make an impact on for their respective teams. We're still waiting, like I said, on the New Orleans Saints job to be filled, so I will come to you with that once that news is announced. But looking at the top 5 head coaching hirings thus far, all of them could be special in their own right, but I do feel like some are better than others, and that will be reflected in my rankings. So without further ado, let's jump right into them. Let's start at number 5, shall we? And this has to be Brian Schottenheimer. And this does not stem from sort of the bad blood I have from him being the Seahawks offensive coordinator, leading to Russell Wilson leaving, ultimately seeing that offense stagnate after a great start, but also why the Cowboys weren't a little bit more ambitious in terms of their head coaching search. It's not like, you had to do your due diligence because of the fact that all these other teams were scooping up top talent. But you also had to dig a little bit deeper if you're the Cowboys, I feel like. Because as much as Brian Schottenheimer is the close-to-home option, a guy who is definitely going to fall under the umbrella of Jerry Jones, I feel like you have to be more ambitious than all these other teams because you're the Dallas Cowboys. And so I feel like this hire was a little bit too safe, and the only thing really good about it is that Brian Schottenheimer kind of has a rapport with Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb. But ultimately, I feel like even with any success this offense might have, much like what happened in Seattle, it will peter out eventually, because this is now a more high-profile position than he was with the Seahawks. This is the Dallas Cowboys head coaching job, one of the most heavily scrutinized in the history of sports. And if you don't succeed and you kind of stagnate like McCarthy did, then I don't know what to tell you if you're the Cowboys. I don't know if it's a Jerry Jones thing. I don't know if the head coaches are the problem, or the players for that matter. I just feel like they're going to be stuck in the cycle where they hire a head coach who just falls into the umbrella of being that yes man to Jerry Jones, and they never have any modicum of continued success or success in the playoffs. And hopefully that will end with Brian Schottenheimer, and he could prove to bring new vision and philosophies to this team. But I just don't see it, because in this high-profile job, I just feel like you can't necessarily be someone who's just going to say yes. You have to be a little bit over-ambitious as the Dallas Cowboys head coach. But that's what they are right now, in my opinion. Not necessarily a team that's going to be looking for the most ambitious hire, but one that's now looking for the safest. So that's why I have this at number 5 thus far. And number 4, I have Liam Cohen, and this could go either way. But it's mainly about the whole lead-up to his hiring and the whole fallout after it. Because I kind of feel like the Jacksonville Jaguars were left stuttering a bit after Johnson and Glenn went. Because I felt a little bit stunned that both the Jets and the Bears moved so quickly, and we'll talk about those situations as well as we go up the rankings. But ultimately, I feel like Jacksonville were just not prepared, and it says a lot about this franchise that they waited until Trent Baalke was fired and then hired Liam Cohen. That just goes to show the dysfunctionality of this Jacksonville Jaguars organization, even now that Trent Baalke's gone. And so, I don't necessarily know how Liam Cohen will feel as kind of the coach that was the last resort, ultimately, in my opinion, but he still is a talented guy. And he knows how to rejuvenate a QB's career. He did it with Geno, he did it with Baker, and now he has the chance to do it with Trevor Lawrence and Brian Thomas Jr., one of the more underrated QB wide receiver tandems in the league. So, I do feel this move has the chance to move up in years to come, but for now it's because of how bizarre it was in nature and how both the organization and Cohen himself reacted. I'm not necessarily that thrilled if I'm a Jacksonville Jaguars fan about this hire and the way it came about. As Caleb Daniels mentions Ted Ginn Jr., I don't necessarily know why, but ultimately, it's a fun name to put out there. So thank you, Caleb Daniels, for that comment. Then number 3, it's Pete Carroll. I feel like Pete Carroll kind of sits in the middle tier of NFL coaches in terms of how he profiles now compared to how he profiled this tenure in Seattle. But ultimately, I feel like the Raiders needed an experienced head in charge, because I feel like Antonio Pierce was a little bit out of his depth at certain moments, and it showed in how he managed games. And thus, Pete Carroll was kind of the smart hiring here for the Raiders. It wasn't necessarily the flashiest, as a lot of people thought it would be, but I definitely think that he could be good for them. Obviously, we're hearing rumors of a Carroll-Wilson reunion in Las Vegas, and I wouldn't be mad at it, because that quarterback situation is certainly very shaky, and you're in the AFC West for that matter, and all the other teams are improving around you. So ultimately, it's going to be a hard job for Carroll, but I think that his experience and his philosophies will come in handy as the Raiders rebuild, because in the early goings, if you run the football, it's going to shock a lot of teams in this very modernized NFL, and now that's the way an NFL is going anyways, running the football, winning football games. But ultimately, I feel like this hire is going to come down to the footprint that Pete Carroll leaves in this team after he either retires is fired or just departs of his own accord. So ultimately, that's where I feel like the importance of this head coaching hiring will come into play. What mark he has on this team after he leaves. And what I mean by that is what he does in this role to truly build back up the Raiders' reputation. If he finds ways to improve this team, really bolster this roster, and get them back to what they once were, then that's good for the franchise. But if he doesn't, then this really was not necessarily a solid move in a year where you could have gone a bit younger, potentially a bit more innovative. But I still like this hire because it's definitely proving to be a lot more experience mattering for Tom Brady and this ownership group of Las Vegas. And Pete Carroll has experience in spades for you. So that's why I find this in the middle tier. Again, one of those that can move up or down, but still one that I want to see after the fact rather than before the fact, because the hype surrounding him is a little bit unwarranted for a team like Las Vegas. So let's see what happens after he leaves the Raiders and see where he's left them at in terms of his tenure here. But then at 2-1, it's got to be the two former Lions coordinators, Aaron Glenn with the Jets and Ben Johnson with the Chicago Bears. And I feel like, they could have been flip-flopped. Glenn could have been top, Johnson too. But ultimately, I feel like the offensive-minded head coach with that Chicago Bears offense had to be over the Aaron Glenn Jets, even though the Jets defense could be seen as better right now than the Chicago Bears offense. But that's what I'm saying about Ben Johnson being number one. The potential of the Chicago Bears offense is what ultimately saw him rank number one in my personal rankings. But it's no indictment of Aaron Glenn. I just think that he has A, the harder job, and B, the harder QB situation. Ben Johnson has a nice, young, second-year quarterback in Caleb Williams with that talented receiving core. Aaron Glenn, on the other hand, certainly has some talent on offense, but Aaron Rodgers could grow disgruntled. Devontae Adams as well, because you know how Aaron goes, Devontae goes. Garrett Wilson could be set to test free agency, perhaps. They might be able to retain Breece Hall, but if they break up the band, they break up the band. And yes, the defensive side of the football for the Jets is the strongest for them, but ultimately, it's going to be tougher for Aaron Glenn in that media circus than Johnson with Caleb Williams, even though a lot of people are expecting better things in year two for Williams because of the innovative nature of what Ben Johnson can do for him. So, while I do love this Aaron Glenn Jr. hiring for the New York Jets, and he's their boy. He played for them. He ultimately loves the culture there, perhaps. I feel like this Ben Johnson hire is going to pay dividends in terms of how he revolutionizes this offense and becomes something truly special. So there you have it, the top 5 NFL head coaching hirings this year, potentially waiting on the Saints to potentially shock us all and get like a really good head coach, but I don't necessarily see it, as no one wants to be in that situation considering the limited cap space and the bizarre quarterback situation. But ultimately, let me know what you think in the comments about all of these head coaching hirings. And coming up to conclude today's show, looking ahead a little bit prematurely to an FA Cup 4th round clash between two teams in Brighton and Chelsea with very stark similarities in how they play and their players, but very differing philosophies in how they achieve their success up to this point. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about it. Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our final segment of today's show, we preview a tasty FA Cup fourth round tie between two teams, like I said before, with very stark similarities in playing style and players, but very differing philosophies to how they got to this point. And in terms of how they might view this cup competition. Now, before we get into it, I do want to apologize in advance. I thought that this was a Premier League fixture before I wrote this down, as I saw all the different Premier League fixtures this coming weekend. And I also suddenly realized just today that this game is not taking place until next week. So sorry in advance, but it's still a very intriguing tie to talk about. Just because both of these teams, like I said, are very similar, but think differently about themselves. Brighton, let's start with them. Brighton are the team that are the ultimate overachievers when it comes to domestically and cup competitions. They have a nice philosophy of bringing young players in, building them up for about 2 to 3 years and sending them off. And they never have to worry about complying with certain rules that are required for Big Six clubs. So, therefore, I feel that if all the Premier League sides were overachievers right now, they are the most capable of knocking off a big boy from the top 6. Chelsea, on the other hand, think they're kind of like Brighton in how sneakily they develop their players. But most of these players are brought in from big clubs. Todd Bowley, now at the helm and the ownership, I feel like has truly changed their transfer philosophy, bringing in all of these players with all of the money he has, not necessarily worrying about the PSR rules, and trying to have them coalesce. That sees them in cup competitions have enough depth to compensate for deep cup runs, but not necessarily achieve success in the Premier League. So, Brighton being the overachievers and Chelsea operating like the overachievers, performing like the underachievers domestically, makes for a very interesting cup tie that I really can't tell you who can win. So I really pondered over this game, and it came down to two things: depth and formation. Because both of these teams have very similar levels of depth, players that they can rely upon in cup ties such as this, and very unique formations that could very well apply for a one-off game like this. Because now we're up to the point, I believe, where there are no replays left to play in the FA Cup. So this is a one-off tie where all that matters is who wins on the day. And what it comes down to when I think of these two teams who I think are very similar, more similar than you know, but perform very differently off the field, comes to a head: depth and formation. So, one way to analyze this could be, just to talk about the formation, but why not let's talk about the last time these teams played in the FA Cup and what formations they used and how they utilized their depth. So without further ado, let's look at the last FA Cup rosters for these respective sides, starting off with Chelsea. And they used, funnily enough, a formation they don't often use, a 4-1-4-1. They most often play the 4-2-3-1, allowing some of their wingers more freedom on the left and right sides. But in this particular game against Morecambe, who you definitely knew were not going to win this game, they decided to go a little bit more hefty on the interplay between their wingbacks and the wings. So they had a roster where Lavia actually was a deep man, a guy from Southampton who I really like in this Chelsea system at certain times. And then you had two, not necessarily primary strikers, but false nines, so to speak, in Joao Felix and Christopher Nkunku, sitting behind, of all people, Mark Guiu. Remember him? I feel like a lot of Chelsea fans don't want to remember Mark Guiu, but he was starting. And the only player who won't be available for Chelsea from this FA Cup roster is Renato Vega, who is now on loan at Juventus. Similarly, Brighton played Norwich, a team that they should be getting by against just fine. They used their traditional 4-2-3-1, which they played with 16 times this season. In this roster, the only player who they will not have available to them is Julian Enciso, who also is on loan to Ipswich Town. But ultimately, I like the setup of this roster a lot for the formation of Brighton here. Estupiñán played at right back very, very nicely in terms of interplay with a guy like Kaoru Mitoma, who loves overlapping runs from his wing backs. But then, looking at the center of the park for them is what I really like. In Yacine Ayari and Carlos Baliba, you have very versatile players who play both domestically a lot and in cup competition, who are young guys but still have the pace and creativity necessary to help you in whatever manner you need them for. And also, it buys into this identity that I talk about with Brighton in terms of their overachieving success. As I don't necessarily know this name, it's in Greek, but he asked, "Can I ask you something? Go ahead, my friend." I might not be able to pronounce your name, but ultimately ask away about some things. But ultimately, when I think about the formations of both of these teams, they match up pretty well. Chelsea, at least in cup competitions, may want to beat you with their superior wing talent because they are not necessarily loaded at the wing back position, even though they have very strong center backs. I feel like Brighton, though, with their 4-2-3-1, can really narrow the field on the defensive side of the ball, which ultimately, in my mind, sees this game swing in their favor. Now let's talk about depth here, because both of these teams use their depth very, very similarly, but ultimately they acquire it very differently. Brighton, on one hand, might be a little bit more unsure of how they want to utilize some of their depth, because while they have a lot of veteran experience, especially in their backline with guys like Veltman, Webster, Lewis Dunk, a lot of their substitutes and a lot of guys who appear in the cup competition for them, especially in areas of creativity, are young guys, attributed to that former FA Cup roster that saw Ayari and Baliba as their two deep line midfielders. I feel like ultimately, though, if you are Brighton, you shouldn't be scared to play your most creative youngsters, because creativity in a cup tie matters a lot. And I feel like to compensate for the lack of depth in your back line, you want to have guys like Yacine Ayari and Carlos Baliba who are more creative in terms of attacking profile, but also have the pace to track back and help your aging back line. But ultimately, it's going to come down to how Hutzela, the manager, really balances out who he rotates in and out in this game. Because if I look at the front 7 or so for this side, in their last FA Cup tie, it was Ayari and Baliba as the deep-lying midfielders, with Mitoma and Ciso and Minto a bit advanced, and Ciso kind of playing behind the striker Jorginho Roter. I feel like a lot of the time, when you think about Brighton, you think about how they interchange and rotate between those 7 players a lot more than you think about the back line. Because the back line, you can choose between Webster, Dunk, a guy like Jan Paul van Hecke, Joel Veltman, and Estupiñán, and not necessarily worry about depth there. You only have to worry about how it looks, because it's definitely an aging backline, and your backup goaltender in Jason Steele is over the age of 33. So ultimately, you're looking at a lot of rotation within your front 7 players. If I'm Hutzela for this matchup, I like the profile of Ayari and Baliba, even though it's risky considering the fact that they're going to be more focused in helping both Mitoma and Minta on the wings in terms of providing service to them, and not necessarily being the guys who want to track back to help that back line. But ultimately, it really creates a mismatch in the midfield should Chelsea go back to their 4-1-4-1 formation and leave Lavia as the only man lying deep. Because I really think that Ayari and Baliba are very creative technically as well. They're able to dribble very well, but also pick out the passes to their wingers that ultimately releases them down the flanks. In terms of Matoma and Minta, they ultimately don't necessarily have to play this whole game, but I do think that in terms of how you want to view it, I think that they would be very nice to have as depth options in terms of your wingers. You can add guys like Simona Dingra maybe on the wings as well, or maybe if you want to have more control, a guy like Jack Hinchelwood a little bit more centrally, but ultimately it's up to them. In terms of Chelsea, on the other hand, I feel like they're going to be a little bit more concerned with wing depth, overpowering you with their wing depth, because they have guys like Joao Felix, like Christopher Nkunku, like Pedro Neto, like a guy like Tyreek George, who I believe made his debut in this game, to really, really hurt you on the flanks. But ultimately, is it the best way for this Chelsea team to go about this cup tie? I think that in terms of predictions, Brighton is playing with house money here. They are ultimately built for cup competitions because they not only put the youngsters out there on the field, but they rely on them. So no matter who's out there, Ayari, Baliba, Minta, Vifa, anyone of that magnitude, they feel like they can win a one-off tie. And it's why they overachieve in the Premier League. Chelsea, on the other hand, they have too many options for a cup competition like this. Too many options to decide on one true starting 11 in the Premier League, and that's why they're underachieving there as well. But for this cup tie, I just think Brighton will look like the superior team on the day. Ruud here could get a couple goals, maybe a goal each from Ayari and Baliba, or one from either of that duo, but ultimately I see Brighton running out 3-2 winners on the day. I think that Chelsea can peg them back a little bit with their wing depth, but ultimately Brighton will prove far too superior with terms of the interplay within their formation and the depth that they can rely upon. Let me know what you think about this game in the comments below, or any other FA Cup fourth round ties for that matter, because that will just about do it for today's show. Thank you all for tuning in. I've been your host, Christopher Shepard. We'll be back here tomorrow, as always, at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Like, follow, and subscribe if you haven't done so already to keep up to date with all new content around the channel. Make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features on YouTube to contribute and interact with the show as always. But without further ado, see you all tomorrow, because I'm out for today.